and welcome. My name is Kris Yee. I am a teacher here. I'm the Dean of Co-Curriculars. When crafting this talk, wasn't actually thinking as much about the co-curricular side of things and the retreats and things like that. So they're mentioned because Kate at one point was like, yeah, you should be talking about those. I was like, oh. But so if you have any further questions about retreats and co-curriculars, things like that we do, please feel free to ask at the end. I tend to speak very quickly, much more quickly than I anticipate, and so likely we'll have some extra time. When I was very, very little, my parents taught me a totally original, incredibly inventive maxim that would go on to haunt me for the rest of my life. This maxim was, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. No one's ever heard that before. Actually, I was shocked to learn much, much later in life, maybe embarrassingly later in life, that they were quoting someone, but I digress. Yeah, that's the weirdest thing. This maxim operates at all times and in every sphere of my life, often keeping me from doing things I'd like to be doing, often leading me to worry about things I wouldn't otherwise worry about. Inasmuch as I'm able, I constantly judge my actions, my work, my life by this principle. Now, certainly many of you do this. The Sermon on the Mount is, regardless of what I might have thought when I was young, no great family secret. It's called to loving, just, thoughtful behavior. It's heard by Christians around the globe. To describe this call as haunting probably sounds a bit melodramatic and a touch over the top. But what's so haunting about the Golden Rule, for me, is that I'm an educator. I remember being a high school student. I know the damage a cruel, inattentive, or lazy teacher can have on a young mind. I must spend every moment of my workday thinking about how I speak to my students, how I discipline them, how I encourage them, how I challenge them, and I must consider whether I'm doing unto them what I would have done unto me. In making decisions about curriculum, in writing tests, in determining the rigor of my classes, the amount of homework that I assign, the tasks I ask students to complete, I must always ask myself whether I would have the same demands, the same standards put onto teenage me. The classes I teach at the Saint Constantine School are difficult. One year, my logic students, most of whom were self-reported A and B students, averaged something like a D on their first quiz. I've had grade books students unilaterally fail writing assignments, and I've collected lab reports wherein every student in the class had to resubmit their work because I just didn't accept it. My high school students are being asked to read well above their grade level, whatever that means, and to grasp concepts that some might describe as too advanced for teenagers. At times, my classes are really, really hard. I've heard stories of students weeping over problem sets, and I've seen them come undone during quizzes that they've realized they didn't adequately prepare for. In short, taking a class with me, and I think taking a class at the Saint Constantine School in general, involves sometimes disappointment and struggle, sometimes even failure. In my classes, bright students who have easily succeeded at everything throughout their lives might not necessarily get an A. And if they do get A's, they'll receive them as they drag themselves exhausted across the finish line of a long, hard race. Reflecting on this, I'm forced to consider the Golden Rule. Is this how I would have others do unto me? Or more importantly for y'all as parents, is this how I would have others do unto my child? When, Lord willing, I'm a parent someday, will I send my children to school here? Will I ask my 14-year-old to take a class on logic, even if it means they spend hours and hours, night after night, staring at the same 5 arguments trying to construct their proofs? Will I enroll my 16-year-old in a physics class that asks them to use vectors to solve kinematics problems in 2 dimensions? Will I wager their GPA, which could be tied to college acceptance, which in turn could be tied to job prospects? Will I wager their GPA on the more rigorous education St. Constantine provides? I ask myself these questions very often. Would I take these risks with my children in the name of their education? Would I, as a student, want a teacher who asks as much of me as I ask of my students? My answer, beyond any shadow of a doubt, is always yes. To understand my confidence in this, we need to take a step back and analyze the purpose of education. What is school? Why do we do it? I know we've touched on this a little bit, but we're all teachers, so really into that. Too often, Education is viewed as a means to an end, as a tool on one's way to success and fortune. You go to school so that you can get a good job, so that you can make money, so that you can feed and house yourself and your family, so that your kids can go to school and get an education, so that they can get a good job, so that they can make money, so that they can feed and house themselves and their families, so that their kids can go to school and get an, you see where I'm going with this. Education in this view is an inevitability, like death and taxes. It exists in order to train the young for their place in the economy and hopefully provide them with the security that a good, stable job provides. Now, I'm very thankful for my good, stable job. I like to eat, and given that I live in Houston, I really love being able to pay for air conditioning. I'd submit, however, that there are more important things in my life than my air conditioning and my Popeyes habit. But if education is really nothing more than a means to the end of financial security, the implication is that financial security is the single most important thing in a person's life. Why else would we choose to spend all of one's childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood preparing for it? Is there nothing else but financial security that we want the next generation to know? Is there nothing other than financially secure that we want them to be? Ultimately, we educate to prepare young people for something. We want them to achieve something, to be something, to attain something. And we train them for years and years to provide them with the ability to reach it. This end, the purpose after which we send them striving, is tied to the very essence of what it means to be human. I'd like to propose that this is deeper, more compelling, and truer than financial security. Obviously, we want our children to be financially secure, but even this desire is just a means to a deeper end. At the end of all the whys, all the questions of purpose and meaning, stands one final answer. Are you ready for this? That means I'm about to give you the meaning of life. Yeah, you didn't even pay for this. This is great. Ultimately, we want to be happy. And we want happiness for our children. And that's what it's all about. So immediately the entire room is split, right? Either I'm a total hippie, or I'm just ripping off Aristotle. It's the second one. So I'm just saying what Aristotle says. So if you know your Aristotle, bear with me. You can tune out for the next 60 seconds or so while I give a lightning quick outline of the Nicomachean Ethics. It'll take more than 60 seconds. It's Aristotle. But please don't ignore me for too long. I get nervous. Okay, so Nicomachean Ethics begins thus. It's his book on ethics, given the name. Every craft and every line of inquiry, and likewise every action and decision, seems to seek some good. That is why some people were right to describe the good as what everything seeks. So, everything that people do in the entire realm of human activity is done for some reason. Right? You don't go to the gym for no reason. You don't go out to dinner for no reason. You don't take that Sunday afternoon trip for no reason. You're always trying to get some greater good out of what you're doing. The difficulty is that when you answer the question of why you're doing what you're doing, the same question occurs again with that thing. For example, I recently got a rowing machine. It was a birthday gift from my parents. That's the second point. Why did I want a rowing machine? Because I want to exercise. Why do I want to exercise? Because I'm a teacher and live a mostly sedentary life and movement is good for someone. Why do I want what's good for me? Right? Do you see how this question of why can be almost infinitely introduced? Why do I want to do what's good for me? Because I feel better when I have a healthier body. Why do I want to feel better? And on, and on, and on. Aristotle argues that there is a terminus to these questions, that there is some one final good at which everything is ultimately aimed. This end might not even be what we're thinking of when we're performing an action, but it's always there as the ultimate prize at the end of our activity. And he asserts that for human beings, the end is happiness. Now, when Aristotle says happiness, he doesn't mean what comes into your head when I say happiness. Generally, we as a culture treat happiness and pleasure as nearly synonymous. This is not what I mean, lest you think I'm saying the purpose of human life is to sit on the couch playing Candy Crush for the rest of your days, because it gives you vaguely positive feelings. When Aristotle says happiness, he's referring to eudaimonia, loosely translated to the good life. You see, for Aristotle, human beings cannot be satisfied with mere pleasure. Mere pleasure is for animals. In Aristotle's system, happiness is not based in pleasure, but in purpose. A being can be happy only if he is participating and doing well in that activity which aligns with his purpose. The purpose of a flautist, for example, is to play the flute. So the happy flautist is one who plays the flute well. The purpose of a barber is to cut hair. So the happy barber is one who cuts hair well. These purposes, however, are tied to part-time activities. If I'm a human being all of the time, which I sincerely hope that I am, then I want to know what my proper activity is as a human being and how I can do it well. Is there some proper function for man qua man that will allow me to live a good life independent of career or hobby? What is the proper activity of man and how can he do it well? Aristotle argues that man's proper function is to perform activity of the soul in accord with reason. So as we, uniquely, are imbued with and defined by our rational souls, it is the rational activity of the soul that constitutes our proper function. To do this well, to perform this activity in the best possible way, is to practice virtue. It is through virtue that human beings are happy, healthy, and fulfilled. Virtuous activity constitutes the whole of human happiness. This is great news, virtuous activity, the whole of human happiness. But take heed, being virtuous is really, really hard. What exactly is virtue for Aristotle? We've said that it governs our rational activity of the soul, such that being virtuous constitutes the whole of human happiness, but what is it to be virtuous? Aristotle conceives of virtue as the moderation between vices. Courage, for instance, is a proper moderation between brashness and cowardice. To be brash is to have too much confidence without enough fear. To be cowardly is to have too much fear without enough confidence. You see, it goes either way. Our reason, when operating rightly, will tell us where the mean lies between these two vices, what it looks like to balance confidence and fear perfectly in order to be truly courageous. Now, this same principle is at work for all virtues in Aristotle's system. The virtue always lies at the balance point between two related vices, the excess and the deficiency. Take generosity as another example. Aristotle describes it as the mean about wealth, namely inasmuch as it relates to the giving and taking of wealth. So the deficiency in regards to generosity would be miserliness. Scrooge, for instance, obviously doesn't give away enough of his wealth. There is also, according to Aristotle, an excess in the realm of giving money, which he calls wastefulness. So proper generosity is neither wasteful nor miserly. It is a virtue perfectly balanced between these two vices, just as courage is perfectly balanced between cowardice and brashness. So this seems fairly simple. So what makes applying it so difficult? Why do we tend to meet so few truly virtuous people out and about in the world? I'll address this question with the chocolate cake example. So every year since I can remember, my mom made me this incredible chocolate cake for my birthday every year. So it was moist and flavorful and fluffy, and she made this like awesome like fudge frosting that went on the top of it that kind of like melted into it a little bit, but it was like, it still like had a little bit of texture to it, so it like contrasted with the fluffiness of the cake. It's just the best cake. Best cake. She'd make the whole thing. Yeah, so she'd make the whole thing, and systematically over the course of like literally the following week, I would have roughly 5 slices of cake every day until it was gone. I'm talking breakfast, pack it in my lunch, eat it when I get home from school, eat it with dinner, have a slice before bed, maybe wake up in the middle of the night having dreamt about it, sneak downstairs and eating more cake. Seriously, I love this cake. So I moved away from home to go to college some 10 or so birthdays ago and feared that my week of binge eating cake was behind me. Fast forward to last week. My incredible wife, Lily, got the cake recipe from my mom and made it for me for my birthday. And it tasted exactly like how my mom always made it. Just the best, most delicious cake ever. But being that I turned 27, not 17, I knew in my head that I probably shouldn't do what I did as a child and hold some sort of like marathon cake eating contest against myself. I thought through all the reasons, I considered the arguments as to why consuming that amount of cake was just an awful idea. Having had these in-depth conversations with myself, how much do you think I managed to slow down my cake consumption?
None at all.
Yeah, not at all. If anything, I ate it even faster because no one in my house was actively trying to stop me from eating it for breakfast. So, all of this to say, I knew rationally that I shouldn't eat an entire cake in under a week. That's crazy. Why would you do that? I could give you all of the arguments about that right now, but I did it anyway. Isn't that weird? Right? Like, I knew exactly what I was supposed to do, and I immediately, without fail, decided that I was going to do exactly the opposite of that thing. Aristotle plans for this. He knows that this is going to happen. He warns that virtue, specifically virtue of character, like courage and temperance, is not performed through force of reason. It's not a think hard enough and know the right answer issue. Virtue of character comes about by one method only: habituation. The more you practice the virtue, the easier it is to perform. After a long enough time doing temperate things, you become temperate. There's no magic formula, and there's no easy way out. If you want to not eat an entire fudge frosted chocolate cake in a week, you just have to practice not eating an entire fudge frosted chocolate cake in a week, over and over again, until like not eating an entire fudge frosted chocolate cake in a week is like a second nature thing to you. Which should be to most people. I realize that this is a deep high. So I obviously don't have it all figured out. But I'm pushing for it, day after day, moment by moment, one step at a time. And this, to circle it back around, is why we ask our students to do hard things. And we consider those hard things an essential and valuable part of a Saint Constantine School education. We believe that education is about the formation of the whole soul. That we are not here just to pump students' brains full of information, or even just to send graduates off to prestigious institutions of higher learning. It's great if they go, but that's not the only reason we're here. We are here, primarily, to prepare young people to live a good, happy life, to be virtuous, and thus to be fulfilled, healthy, thriving members of their communities, be they scholastic, ecclesial, professional, or familial. And because our goal is to win students over to the good life, we can't simply stand in front of them and tell them what it means to be virtuous. Knowledge of virtue by itself will not help them be virtuous. I couldn't care less if one of my students could quote to me the entire Nicomachean Ethics by memory, if he is a scoundrel and a cheat. I couldn't care less if one of my students goes to get a degree at Harvard Law, if she sells her soul and her principles to do it. I'd prefer my students be virtuous, happy people. I strive for that as for nothing else. And for this, for the practice of virtue, that it might become part of my students' character. For this do I ask a lot of my students. In asking them to do really hard things, I think they learn something that I could never teach them in a lecture. There's a well-documented and quite frankly fascinating phenomena that occurs with my 9th grade logic class every year. Throughout the year, the students tend to complain a lot about the difficulty. Yeah, no, this is the interesting or fascinating part about the difficulty of the class, right? They'll bomb a quiz or spend a really, really long time on homework that they still don't figure out, and as a result, they'll complain to me that I should be making the class easier, that it's too hard, that they're just freshmen. Rather than accept that the class is difficult and will take a lot of hard work, most students choose to appeal to weakness, inability, or low expectation. So complain, complain, complain they go all the way towards the end of the year. But something always happens by the next fall, and this is the thing that's fascinating. Those same students will return to me, tell me that they wish they were taking logic with me again this year, and tell the incoming freshmen that it's like an awesome class and they're gonna love it. I point out to them that they seem to have drastically changed their tune since the spring. They'll say something like, yeah, I know, but that class was so awesome. And so I don't say this to toot my own horn. Full disclosure, I expect that the students who I don't have these conversations with might still hate the class. That's incredibly possible. But I think that it is an interesting phenomenon. A class that at the time was considered impossible, over the top, too much for them, ends up becoming a fond memory of triumph and the joy of learning. I suspect that those students are growing in virtue, that they are more determined, long-suffering, and willing to persevere than they were before. In preparation for this talk, I did a thing that I almost never ever do. I read a pop psychology book. Right? It's a curious thing about being a great books educator. Like, I just don't read things that were written in the last 50 years. Almost never. Like, I don't have time. There's too much other stuff that I haven't read that's better and older. And I don't know. At least people know that it's better. Who knows? Whatever. Anyways, the book is called Grit. The author is Dr. Angela Duckworth. I was attracted to the book by the study that originated it and won Dr. Duckworth her MacArthur Genius Grant. She explains the premise of her study as follows. I'm going to read a significant portion because, yeah. The admissions process for West Point is at least as rigorous as for the most selective universities. Top scores on the SAT or ACT and outstanding high school grades are a must. But when you apply to Harvard, you don't need to start your application in the 11th grade. And you don't need to secure a nomination from a member of Congress, a senator, or the vice president of the United States. You don't, for that matter, have to get superlative marks in a fitness assessment that includes running, push-ups, sit-ups, and pull-ups. Each year, in their junior year of high school, more than 14,000 applicants begin the admission process. This pool is winnowed down to just 4,000 who succeed in getting the required nomination. Slightly more than half of those applicants, about 2,500, meet West Point's rigorous academic and physical standards. And from that select group, just 1,200 are admitted and enrolled. Nearly all the men and women who come to West Point were varsity athletes, most were team captains. And yet, 1 in 5, 20%, 1 in 5 cadets will drop out before graduation. What's more remarkable is that historically, a substantial fraction of dropouts leave in their very first summer during an intensive 7-week training program named, even in official literature, Beast Barracks. Or for short, just Beast. Who spends 2 years trying to get into a place and then drops out in the first 2 months? So Dr. Duckworth goes on to describe Beast Barracks. It's a grueling 7-day-a-week, no-break program that consists in literally just all day you're doing drills and exercising and functionally eating at some point, but pretty much just drills and exercising, and that's all you do. Her project was to figure out which students would drop out during Beast Barracks and how they could potentially be identified ahead of time. What sort of candidate was it who gave up in the first 2 months of West Point? It turns out there was no correlation whatsoever between the whole candidate score. So this is a score that's a weighted average of SAT and ACT exam scores, high school rank adjusted for population of the school, expert appraisers of leadership potential, performance on physical fitness tests. So there's no correlation between that score and Beast Barracks dropout rate. None. They couldn't predict it. People with great scores would stay in, people with great scores would drop out, people with low scores would stay in, people with low scores would drop out. Dr. Duckworth developed a survey-based test to try to figure this out, called the GRIT scale. It has questions in it asking candidates to rank themselves 1 to 5 on statements like, setbacks don't discourage me, I don't give up easily, and I finish whatever I begin. Candidates would take the survey, and the results would give what Dr. Duckworth calls a GRIT score. It's functionally a measure of self-reported perseverance and determination. She first conducted the study in 2004, when 1,218 students completed the survey. 71 of those students, 71 out of 1,200, dropped out by the end of Beast. And Dr. Duckworth found a direct correlation between GRIT score and which candidates dropped out. She went on to try out this GRIT score survey in a bunch of other arenas and found that it worked as a predictor in a shocking number of fields. GRIT score could predict salespeople that would persist in sales for more than a few months. It could predict high school graduation rates and one's likelihood to make it to the Green Berets. It even, interestingly enough, predicted which kids would progress to the final round of the Scripps National Spelling Bee. In all of these cases, given a baseline of talent and physical fitness, grit was the attribute that could always reliably predict success. In her book, Dr. Duckworth highlights 2 other psychological studies on this topic that I find absolutely illuminating, if a little sad. Let me read them to you. So the first one, let me wind the clock back to 1964. 2 first-year psychology doctoral students named Marty Seligman and Steve Mayer are in a windowless laboratory, watching a caged dog receive electric shocks to its back paws. I know it's really sad. It was sad reading about psych studies. Yeah, it's in 64. I don't know, I guess you can electrocute dogs then. I don't like it. But still, shocks come randomly and without warning. If the dog does nothing, the shock lasts 5 seconds. But if the dog pushes its nose against a panel at the front of the cage, the shock ends early. In a separate cage, another dog is receiving the same shocks at exactly the same intervals, but there's no panel to push. In other words, both dogs get the exact same dosage of shock at the exact same times, but but only the first dog is in control of how long each shock lasts. After 64 shocks, both dogs go back to their home cages and new dogs are brought in for the same procedure. The next day, one by one, all the dogs are placed in a different cage called a shuttle box. In the middle, there's a low wall just high enough that dogs can leap the barrier if they try. A high-pitched tone plays, heralding an impending shock, which comes through the floor on the first half of the shuttle box where the dog is standing. Nearly every dog who had control over shocks on the previous day learned to leap the barrier. They hear the tone and they jump over the wall to safety. In contrast, 2/3 of the dogs who had no control over the shocks on the previous day lie down whimpering, passively waiting for the punishments to stop. Right? I know. Torturing dogs is really sad, and part of me just hates hearing it. But I find it so fascinating. Fascinating might be the wrong word because it feels like a duh moment, right? When suffering occurs without hope, without the possibility of relief, the natural response is hopelessness. Like the dogs who lie down, whimper, and wait for the end, those of us unfamiliar with suffering, or rather with triumph over suffering, will naturally respond to it with passivity and hopelessness. If you don't have any reason to believe that you can bounce back from hardship, what option do you have but despair? But if you experience suffering and fight through it, if you can find your way to the other side of the hardship and beat it, doesn't it make sense that you'd become a fighter? The one who endures suffering and comes out stronger indeed comes out stronger. There's a very hard fact that I face every year as a teacher. It certainly must be 1,000 times more difficult as a parent. Suffering is promised to all men and women. When a student graduates from our school and leaves for the last time, he or she walks into a world that will certainly hurt them. This is an inevitability. As much as I might want to be some sort of infinitely strong giant who can hold on to all my students in my big, strong hands and keep them from suffering, at the end of the day, I can only be the stone giant who sits looking at his empty hands saying, "They look like big, good, strong hands, don't they? I always thought that's what they were. My little friends, I couldn't hold on to them." At the end of the day, my perseverance and my determination and my force of will cannot protect my students. It will not serve them in their time of suffering. They must call on their own grit that they have learned through years and years of hard work and suffering and failure and redemption. I want to read you one more psychological study. Yes, there still is the light torture of animals. This time it's rats rather than dogs, so maybe that'll help. I quote again from Dr. Duckworth. "A few years ago, Steve Mayer and his students designed an experiment nearly identical to the one that he and Marty Seligman had conducted 40 years earlier. One group of rats received electric shocks, but if they turned a small wheel with their front paws, they could turn off the shock until the next trial. A second group received the exact same dose of electric shocks as the first, but had no control over their duration. One crucial difference was that in the new experiment, the rats were only 5 weeks old. That's adolescence in rat life cycle. A second difference was that the effects of this experience were assessed 5 weeks later, when the rats were fully mature adults. At that point, both groups of rats were subjected to uncontrollable electric shocks, and the next day observed in a social exploration test. Here's what Steve learned. Adolescent rats who experienced stress they could not control grew up to be adult rats who, after being subjected to uncontrollable shocks a second time, behaved timidly. This was not unusual. They learned to be helpless in the same way that any other rat would. In contrast, adolescent rats who experienced stress they could control grew up to be more adventurous and, most astounding, appeared to be inoculated against learned helplessness in adulthood. That's right, when these resilient rats grew up, the usual uncontrollable shock procedure no longer made them helpless. Now, what I don't want to do is compare the education of your children to the laboratory-based electric shocks so many times. But, however, I find this study even more encouraging than the first. I'll read this last part again. Adolescent rats who experienced stress they could control grew up to be more adventurous and, most astounding, appeared to be inoculated against learned helplessness in adulthood. School, especially high school, is in many ways a practice run for adult life. We ask students to do good, hard work. We make them meet deadlines and learn how to do new things. We challenge them to make their own decisions and come up with their own ideas, pushing back on those ideas and decisions when they are flawed, faulty, or incomplete. We drop them into uncomfortable social situations and ask them to make friends and develop communities. We ask them to do all of these things not because they are easy, as JFK said, but because they are hard. We ask them to do these hard things now, not later. Now is the time for them to be courageous and determined and long-suffering before it is absolutely necessary. God forbid our students experience their first true adversity unpracticed in the art of taking it on the chin and getting back up. It is not a mercy, but a cruelty to coddle them, to demand less than their best, to allow for complacency and laziness and cowardice. Here in secondary school, while students still live in their parents' homes and are surrounded by caring educators who see them and know them and love them dearly, this is the place where it is safe for them to fail. Where missing a deadline means half a letter grade deducted from the assignment. Where falling asleep in class means a trip to your house head and a conversation about attentiveness. Where failing a class means academic probation and more intensive one-on-one tutoring. These consequences, when compared to the consequences they'll face later in life, are hardly consequences at all. Here, failing at something means you get more help, more support, and you're invited to be better and you're assisted in doing so. The world is rarely so kind. We push our students because we want them to struggle. We want them to have to persevere. We want every grade on the report card to mean something. We do our students no favors when we let them phone it in. Moreover, consider the rats. The adolescents who learned that there was hope, who learned that you can grit your teeth and force your way through a time of suffering. These were able to deal with even purposeless suffering later in life. When the day comes for great trial, and it certainly will come, the golden rule tells me that I had better have done everything I can to prepare my students ahead of time. I had teachers that did that for me. I still recall fondly and with fear my high school drama teacher and how she put the fear of God in anyone who didn't know his lines or who was goofing around during rehearsal. Both of these things were things I did. I remember my AP Bio teacher. I hated AP Bio. Right? I remember, I'm pretty sure she gave me my first C, actually. Like, I was generally an A student. I'm pretty sure AP Bio gave me my first C. I remember spending hours and hours at the desk in my room copying and recopying notes on the cell or organisms, or I don't even remember, so that I could maybe, just maybe, pull an A on the next test. I remember being challenged by my discussion group in college, how they told me I was letting them down by treating discussion flippantly, that they expected more from me. It's because of that conversation that I'm here today. It's such a cliche, and it makes me feel like I'm turning into my parents, but I'm hard on my students because I love them. I want them to be virtuous, to make perseverance and courage mainstays in their character. I want them to have good practice doing hard things so that they can keep doing hard things for the rest of their lives. This is why we set high academic standards. This is why we go on retreats and force students to work hard on group dynamics, to learn to love people that they don't naturally like. This is why we make everyone 6th grade and up sleep in tents for the winter retreat, even if it's raining. We refuse to raise up a generation of helpless victims. Suffering and adversity will come for our students, and we will do everything we can to be sure that they're ready. It's what my parents and teachers did for me, and I pray it's what my children's teachers will do for them. Thank you. Questions? Yes?
I think that nurturing is an aspect. There was another rat study that the adolescents that were licked by their mother was like, what I'm going through with him is like what they should talk to you about instead of like terrible twos, because that's nothing. Outlets, covering outlets, nothing. And what we struggle with is learning the self-discipline through Burgess behavior, like, should we just stick him in Harlingen, a military academy, so that, you know, at 6 a.m. they're, you know, beating it out of him to make his bed virtuously so he can develop that habit. These are the struggles, because I'm aware of that, and I want to go look up that grit test, so I can go give all my kids the grit test right now. And so that's where I'm struggling as a parent with my very first high schooler. So if you can share a little bit, because I think you guys lick the students really well.
We try to lick as many of them as possible.
I gotta figure out a different word.
I don't know, I like it. I think it's scrappy.
He's a little salty. He had some chocolate cake.
Yeah, so that's a huge part of why we insist on class sizes being as small as they are, and why we lean into the house system as much as we do. Because this virtue is a learned thing over a long period of time, right? It's necessary that every student is going to be at a different place in this journey, right? So like I can push some of my seniors in a way that would utterly break some of my sophomores, right? I actually don't have sophomores this year, juniors even, right? And I have to always be able to do my best to tell at any given time when someone can be pushed and when they can't. And be ready for when they can't to, like them for lack of a better word, but to be able to be there and to be supportive and to be loving and to be encouraging, and I think it's a both and. I think there's this one of the stories that I didn't put in this talk that was from that book was about Steve Young. It was about him like sort of being a kind of rough and tumble like football prospect, getting to BYU. He got put on the meat squad at BYU, like wasn't playing. Called his dad, said that like, I want to come home, I'm never going to play, this is stupid, I'm just getting beat up all the time. And his dad basically told him, if you drop out of school, you're not moving back in. And you hear that story and you're like, man, Steve Young's dad, kind of a jerk. But when you talk to Steve Young in interviews about that, he would say, yeah, my dad knew me, right? He knew that he could push me that much, and I would do the thing that was ultimately good for me, that I ultimately wanted to do, so I was having trouble doing. But I think if you don't know your student, you don't know your kid, then making that push could be too much. So it's hard and terrifying, and there's not really a great answer other than praying a lot and doing your best. Because we don't know. Because sometimes, we have some students that will sort of constantly be having some sort of crisis and always like demanding that we come help them with their crisis. And after a while, it's like I think you need to just go be out in the world and not be coddled by me right now. I don't think you need any more of my affection. I think you need to like just go do it. And
do you use those words?
not in as many words as that. I'm generally more careful than that. But yeah, I mean, it would be like hey, I think it would be better if you go do this right now. It's okay if you're crying. You can go. Like, so we did some alone time at retreat where we asked them, because we took away their phones, which was already like we killed them. And then we also asked them to then go spend time alone by themselves in nature, not talking to anyone and not walking around and just sitting and being and praying and thinking. And we had some students that were like, I don't like this. This is uncomfortable, and I feel scared, and I'm crying. Can I come back and stop having alone time? I'm like, it might be good that you're having this experience. Like, maybe you need this. And so being able to say that in a way that isn't too harsh, but still kind of appropriately pushes them out of the nest, I think is a constant struggle.
It sounds like all the educators have really a pretty good grasp on what the project of the school is. And I wonder if you give the kids some sort of system with which they can reflect on their own personal strengths. Like, do they take a strength finders test, or is there something that's a bit more systematic?
So we don't do any of the in the systems for that, but we do. So we intro the students to the school in general, to what we're doing here and what we're trying to get them to do. Every year at the summer retreat, we do that for the high school students. And yeah, again, we have house heads that are sort of continuously checking in on and sort of getting updated on where students are at and how they're doing. And so there's a kind of like a one-on-one sort of relative aspect to that. We haven't really quantified it at all, but.
Just a comment about, I think, as kids get older and enter high school, you know, the teen years in high school, it's important for the adults in their life, whether it be their parents at home or grandparents, teachers at school, to actually start modeling what they're teaching them and expecting them to be like. I can't, with my 16 and 13-year-old anymore, say, well, just do it because I say so. I could do that when they were young and they needed to obey without understanding necessarily, but now but then they'll say, well, what about you?
Yeah.
Not in a defiant way, but in a way that I would expect them to come back and say, but Mama, what about you? You know, am I modeling that for them? Whatever it may be.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's a component I think it's important to keep in mind when we're expecting standards from our students or our children, that we are modeling the same. Now, we can't do it consistently, we're human, but then owning up to that, because then we're teaching them it's okay to fail, then you own up and then you carry on, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So,
And I think that's part of why it's so valuable. Like all of our great books teachers, we read books side by side with the students that we're prepping for discussion. So, you know, I'm teaching the seniors this summer. I've read all 1,250 pages of War and Peace. There were other things that I would have rather done with my time. Actually, in hindsight, there aren't other things I would rather have done with my time, but at the time I was like, I don't want to read this book right now. And even being sort of like, yeah, like I'm writing papers, I'm in school, and sort of being open and sharing that with students. I totally let students read papers that I'm writing sometimes if they want to. And I think that is really important, and to show them that it grows, right? Like,
Exactly.
you know, this is impossible for you right now to write your 8-page paper. Here's a 35-page paper that I just had to write for my grad program. Like, you can do this, right? Like, I was not the best student in my grade. So.
Well, when we moved to Houston, for instance, I was freaked out about finding places because I am not a map person. I can't understand maps, and I didn't know the city, and I needed to take them places or get things done. And I needed to think, okay, if I'm not going to model for them, then I'm going to take a risk and try something. How do I expect them to cope with moving to a new country, learning a whole new way of life? So that, you know, I've been learning a lot and growing a lot.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that we are learning also, just as the educators are, because every child is different. And I guess if we show them as well, because we're in that process of learning, that their characters, you know, we're all adjusting, and the oldest one's always going to be our first for everything. And it's just understanding that and showing our human side of us, because, you know, like she and I was talking, we can tell them to do this when they're little, but when they're older, they have more reason, and they can see, and we just have to show our human side. It helps a little bit.
Absolutely. Question?
I have two questions, and answer the first one and answer the second. But is Dr. Beckworth saying that grit can be learned?
Yes.
Syllogism. Grit can be learned, therefore, we're teaching grit at SCS, therefore, your child at the end of 4 years at SCS is going to have grit?
That's the hope. Right, and so it's one of those things that's internal to each student, right? Like students can choose how much they want to engage and how much they don't, right? This study really plays out in our experience of students that we've had success and that we haven't had success with, right? Like some of our best students are those that just care and they want to do the work and they're willing to do the work. Right, I have some students that will end up with the highest CQ average in their grade books class, even though they had the lowest initial turn-in CQ average in their grade books class, because they'll write it and they'll rewrite it and they'll rewrite it and they'll fix it. And we keep putting those challenges in front of them, and we keep asking them to do more and expect them to do more. And the hope, the goal, is that in doing so, that will develop that grit in them.
So they have to want it, you're saying? So is SES for every student?
I think so. I really do, because this isn't, right, what the studies that Dr. Duckworth did suggest is that success isn't tied to like IQ, right, or your smarts, right? It's tied to a sort of a function of your character. It's your willingness to do work. And so, yeah, we get students that initially don't want to. And so that's the other big part of what we do as teachers is we continuously are trying to make learning and knowledge and growth attractive, right? Show them that, you know, being a grown-up doesn't mean being boring and lame, right? It means developing deeper and greater interest and being a more interesting person. And that's part of why the retreats are so important as well, because, right, as much as I tell students whatever I tell them and model for them whatever I model for them, the people that they're surrounded by are going to have a huge impact on who they end up being. And so we're consistently always trying to reinstill the values of the school in the student culture, reestablish the student culture, establish a culture that, you know, it's not cool to slack off and not do your reading for grade books class, right? Like, I've seen this year specifically, like, students that, like, maybe didn't read, right, not in my class, but in other classes, and that are so full of shame and are not telling everyone. And that's exactly right, right? We don't want a culture where, like, it's good to slack off, or it's, like, cool to slack off and to, like, not care and to brush things off. And so part of what we're doing with the retreats is continuous culture building, continuously asking them to sort of drop the identity that comes with, like, a stereotypical American teenager and pick up a sort of identity that is interesting and interested and cares and wants to grow. Yes.
I'm not exactly sure where I'm going with this. This is
Okay.
an out loud thought. This is an out loud thought.
Yeah.
Like, I have younger kids, and one of the things that I learn with them, like, when they're in pain, like their body's in pain, they don't know that it's going to stop.
Yeah.
And like, so you actually have to say, this is going to stop in like 3 minutes, like it's going to be over. And like literally their entire body relaxes and they go, okay.
Yeah.
And like translating that into like emotional or like spiritual other struggles, kind of what else I took from the studies that you were talking about is that you may have a period of pain, but you also have to bring relief. Like there's periods where you push them, and then there's periods where you give them grace, and there's a relief, and you even can tell them in advance, this is temporary. Like this isn't going to last. Because I think even emotionally, like as kids are developing, they don't know that there's the other side. Like they have to be told, you're not going to feel like this forever, or this is going to go, you know, this is a short period of time of pain or struggle or whatever, but it's going to be over.
Yeah.
And it just kind of like with those, it's a period.
Yeah.
And just communicating that to them can be very helpful.
Right. I think a constant firmness and high expectation coupled with extravagant grace is always what's appropriate. Right. I remember, I think 2 years ago at our Harvest Festival, I saw one of my logic students weeping in her sister's car. Just undone. I went over and like knocked on the window, and apparently she knew that she had just bombed her final, and that she needed to do well in her final to do well in the class. And so, you know, in that moment, that was not the appropriate moment for me to be like, well, life's hard and there's consequences, kid, rock up, right? But it was still an appropriate moment to challenge, right? What I did is told her that you can come back tomorrow and retake your final, and I will take your second grade. But you need to go home and do nothing but study until you come back tomorrow. And she went home, and I don't know that she slept. Like, she crammed all night and totally aced her final. And it was awesome, and it was great. And of course she deserves an A, right? Like, I'm not gonna take an A away from that student because they didn't meet a deadline or they didn't do something right, right? It's about giving that second chance, but while still providing that challenge. It's not giving them a way out, it's giving them a way, like, back. Yes.
Kris, just a comment. I'm a new parent, and I happen to be an Aristotelian psychotherapist.
Whoa! I hope I did okay then. I'm glad I didn't know that before. I would have been insanely nervous.
But as a parent, and also as a guy who uses Aristotle and Marty Seligman in my practice, it was phenomenal. And it's very good to be able to hear that information is being brought into the classroom, and it's just once you know, that was fantastic.
Thank you so much.
And our new student here has been complaining about one class being too hard. It's like, I came for this talk. And I'm an educator as well. So what you've said will go down to my students as well. So appreciate it.
I'm thinking about actually requiring some of my students to watch the video as part of just because they are complaining so much right now.
Yeah.
Physics especially. Physics is the one where everyone's like, I'm like, okay.
What video are you talking about?
They just recorded the video of me saying this.
I'm making my kids listen to the Grit audiobook.
Oh,
Just
yeah.
so it's not coming from me.
Yeah.
Like it's these other people.
And as a school, we try to reinstill these values regularly with them. So over retreat with the high schoolers, Mrs. Gilbert gave several different talks about, and one of which was about grit and why we make them read as many pages as we do. Because right now, most of them are reading more than a lot of college freshmen would in their classes. And that might even be true of our middle schoolers as well. I mean, at least in my undergraduate experience, it was that way. But, so it's not like they're just hearing it one time and expected to remember this. This is being reinstilled with them all the time. So know that you guys are being supported by us. Thank you for, as families, coming alongside us and doing this hard work with us. It makes a huge difference.
Cool. All right, I think that is about time, so you get a 5-minute break, go bathroom.